You're all very welcome, and you're welcome if you're joining us online as well. We're pleased to have with us Marilynn Richtarik, who is Professor of English at Georgia State University. Marilynn was educated at Harvard, where she studied American literature and history, and was Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, where she did Friel on Irish theatre. Marilynn's first book, Field Day, is an essential reading for any scholar of Irish drama. Her second book, biography of Stewart Parker, was shortlisted for the Rhodes Prize from the Royal Irish Academy. And her new book, Getting to Good Friday, is just out with LP. So we're delighted to have Marilynn with us here today, talking about making history.
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you for inviting me. Brian Friel's Making History, first produced by the Field Day Theatre Company in 1988, takes as its subject the anglicized Elizabethan-era Irish leader Hugh O'Neill, a Gaelic chieftain, an English earl, and for a time, the best hope of the European counter-Reformation. O'Neill is chiefly remembered by Irish nationalists as the mastermind of the Gaelic aristocracy's last stand against English colonization, whose defeat at the Battle of Kinsale and subsequent exile from Ireland cleared the way for the plantation of Ulster in the early 17th century. Friel's drama, however, focuses on his brief marriage to a new English settler named Mabel Bagenal. Academic critics of Making History have correctly pointed out that far from replacing heroic myth with less heroic truth, as a naive reading of it might suggest, Friel deliberately replaced one historical myth with another. Friel's factual distortions in the play are neither incidental nor accidental, but there has been less attention paid to the nature of the story he used the play to tell and to his reasons for telling it. A fuller understanding of Making History will result from the recognition that Friel wanted not only to talk about the writing of history or to rewrite it himself, but to help make it through storytelling. Friel's dramaturgical decisions during the 4 years he spent writing Making History also advanced his political aim of demonstrating that division along sectarian lines in Ireland need not be a defining feature of political life. As Stewart Parker remarked about his own play, Northern Star, centered on the leader of another failed Irish rebellion, this is not an historical play, although set centuries in the past, but very much a play about today. Friel sought to influence events in his own Ireland by demonstrating the futility of violence as a means to the nationalist ideal of Irish independence and integrity. At a time when he knew the Republican movement was riven by debates between those who favored engaging in the political process and those who saw armed struggle as the only way to achieve a sovereign, united Ireland, he wished to bolster the position of the former. As a liberal nationalist, Friel believed that the only realistic path to a united Ireland would be to persuade present-day unionists that their cultural differences would be accepted and their rights respected in a reconstituted Irish state. Thus, he wanted his audiences to believe in the possibility of a new cultural synthesis in Ireland that would include both Protestants and Catholics. To that end, he wished to show a more positive side of Northern Protestantism than nationalist members of his Irish audiences might previously have encountered, and to give the unionist members of these audiences sympathetic characters with whom they could identify. He wanted to illustrate both the challenges and the promise of cultural cross-fertilization. Since none of these goals could be achieved unless the play was widely seen and discussed, Friel also wished to write a popular play, and thus worked hard to avoid a polemical or didactic tone. Making history served his rhetorical purposes best when audiences received it primarily as a good story. Like the Irish literary revival at the turn of the 20th century, the Derry-based Field Day Theatre Company emerged in 1980, largely as a response to political stagnation. Since the 1974 collapse of the first power-sharing devolved government in Northern Ireland, there had been no plausible initiative to bridge the gap between unionists and nationalists. As bleak as the situation had seemed in 1974, it looked much worse by 1981, when Friel and Field Day co-founder Stephen Ray invited David Hammond, Seamus Heaney, Seamus Dean, and Tom Holland to join them on Field Day's board of directors. Between October 1980 and October 1981, two protracted hunger strikes by Republican prisoners to underline their demand for political status had had the effect of greatly increasing sympathy, if not support, for the provisional IRA among Catholics. Nationalists like Friel, who did not consider violence an effective means towards any political end, regarded this development with alarm. Significantly, in a letter to the new Field Day directors in September 1981, Friel noted that one of the ideas he and Ray had for the company was that it might find some means of celebrating the best of the Northern Protestant tradition. Garret FitzGerald, then Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, seemed to be thinking along similar lines when he announced on the 27th of September 1981 his intent to lead a Republican crusade to make this a genuine republic on the principles of Tone and Davis. He regarded as a basic obstacle to a united Ireland the fact that the Irish state is itself sectarian, not in the acutely sectarian way Northern Ireland was, in which Catholics were repressed, but in the sense that our laws and our constitution, our practices, our attitudes reflect those of a majority ethos and are not acceptable to Protestants in Northern Ireland. Changing these could create a basis on which many Protestants in Northern Ireland would be willing to consider a relationship with us. During the hunger strikes, Provisional Sinn Féin had begun contesting elections, soon afterward formally adopting a policy of fielding candidates for these, while at the same time continuing their military campaign. Both the British government and the SDLP began to fear a scenario in which Sinn Féin would surpass the SDLP as the voice of Northern nationalists, an apprehension exacerbated in June 1983, when a UK general election returned Gerry Adams as MP for West Belfast, and Sinn Féin received 13.4% of the total votes to the SDLP's 17.9%. By this time, SDLP leader John Hume had already registered the risk and approached FitzGerald, Taoiseach again after a hiatus through most of 1982, with the idea for a forum where all constitutional parties committed to a new Ireland would together define what we really wish this new Ireland to be. In particular, Hume asked parties in the Republic to join with us in abandoning rhetoric and, by placing their cards on the table, show what sort of role there will be for the Protestant community. The New Ireland Forum met for a year between May 1983 and May 1984. The four major constitutional nationalist parties on the island participated, representing over 90% of nationalists in Ireland. The body's deliberation of ways to unify Ireland peacefully was theoretical rather than practical, because Sinn Féin was excluded for refusing to renounce violence as a tactic, and the various unionist parties declined to take part. Nevertheless, it manifested a new pragmatism among nationalists about the actual barriers to a united Ireland. Thinking in concrete terms about what a reconstituted Ireland might actually look like, forum participants shifted the debate away from notions of ownership and conquest towards reconciliation and accommodation. As Hume later commented, we had for too long stressed this essential unity of Ireland, but forgotten about its equally essential diversity. The forum, therefore, needed to forge a new, unheard of, generous definition of Irishness, which would include, not exclude, everything that was encompassed in being a Northern Protestant, including a sense of British identity. Field Day, too, was publicly committed to creating a sense of Irishness which could gain assent throughout the island. A distinctive feature of the company was its symbolic rejection of both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom in favor of a political entity that did not yet exist. As Friel explained to Fintan O'Toole in 1982, you can't deposit fealty to a situation like the Northern situation that you don't believe in. Then you look south of the border, and that enterprise is in so many ways distasteful. He thought the Republic could be adjusted and could be made very exciting, but it requires the Northern thing to complete it. I'm talking about the whole Northern thing. Declaring his faith in the possibility of a cultural whole available to us, Friel elaborated. How to achieve that and how to contribute to that is one of the big problems. When O'Toole asked directly if Field Day's project depended on political nationalism and on the achievement of a united Ireland, Friel replied coyly, I think it should lead to a cultural state, not a political state. And I think out of that cultural state, a possibility of a political state follows. In keeping with the welcoming spirit that also animated the New Ireland Forum, Field Day devoted considerable energy in the mid-1980s to efforts to reach Northern Protestants, although owing to the delay between deciding to do something and the fruits of that decision, many of these initiatives were not apparent at the time. These various Field Day projects preoccupied Friel during the period when he was working on making history. And that play should be seen as part of his effort to orient Field Day towards helping to persuade Northern Protestants that they had more in common with Northern Catholics than with the rest of the British population. Even, ideally, to help them recognize that, in some ways at least, they were Irish themselves. The inspiration for making history probably came to Friel in the spring of 1983, when he read Seamus Dean's contribution to the first set of Field Day pamphlets, Civilians and Barbarians. Dean traces the colonialist imagery of English civilization versus Irish barbarism from the 16th through the late 20th century. And his analysis likely reminded Friel of Sean O'Faolain's book, The Great O'Neill, which had made a significant impression on him years before. In this biography of O'Neill, O'Faolain anticipates the attitudes of both revisionists and post-colonial historians and cultural critics. His interpretation of O'Neill's career centers on his subject's self-division, the way in which he was torn between his respectful comprehension of Renaissance English modes of social and political organization and his abiding fondness for Gaelic culture. In 1587, Queen Elizabeth I proclaimed him Earl of Tyrone and gave him control of a territory roughly corresponding to present-day Northern Ireland. In 1595, after openly rebelling against his English masters, he became the O'Neill, leader of a legendary line of Gaelic chieftains, and the nucleus for the first groping movements of the Irish towards a concept of national identity. Ironically, it was O'Neill's early and extensive exposure to English thought and culture that gave him the perspective necessary to imagine a similar status for Ireland. Reflecting on O'Frailon's indictment of Gaelic culture's inflexibility, which made it vulnerable to obliteration in the dawning modern age, Friel decided that this must be close to the kernel of the play. The recognition of, and indeed, the demonstrated theatrically love for the old ways and the recognition of the demands of change. O'Frailon believed that O'Neill's wiliness as a politician was integral to his achievement as a military strategist, because, with one fateful exception, he did not let his desire for success in battle obscure his longer range goal of achieving security and autonomy for himself and his allies. Thus, time and again during the 9 Years' War he led against the English in Ireland from 1595 to 1603, he sued for peace and pardon just when he seemed to be winning. O'Frailon understood that a military victory, in the sense of a vast overthrow of numbers by numbers, was always out of the question, asserting that O'Neill was the first to grasp this fact, an able politician and an able general, and the only big man in all Irish history from beginning to end of that dual order. Queen Elizabeth accepted these hypocritical surrenders because as long as O'Neill maintained control of his own territory, his nominal allegiance represented her only claim to that part of Ulster. Sadly, from this perspective, O'Neill is best known for his uncharacteristic decision to launch a head-on assault on English forces at the Battle of Kinsale in December 1601, resulting in a disastrous defeat that effectively determined the outcome of the war and sounded the knell of the old Gaelic order in Ireland. Contemplating this loss in January 1984, Friel wondered, if Kinsale marked the end of Irish independence in any form for 3 centuries, what was determining about the event? He decided at this time that his O'Neill would have to discuss the pursuit of his aims by diplomacy, politics, and arms. O'Frailon emphasizes that much of the pressure on O'Neill in December 1601 stemmed from the invading Spanish fleet's choice of Kinsale in the extreme south of Ireland as their landing point. O'Neill's hopes for an outright military victory hinged on such foreign intervention, but Spain's interests and his own did not entirely align. If the Spanish had been as focused as he was on consolidating control of Ireland, they would have landed in the north or west of the island, where the native population was already roused against the English colonists. Instead, they were thinking beyond the Irish campaign to a planned invasion of England. The incident illustrates the ambiguous position in which O'Neill found himself by the end of the 16th century as a leader of the Counter-Reformation, because the financial and military aid he received from Spain and from the Pope came with strings attached. Nevertheless, O'Phelan saw Catholicism in this period as a useful coagulant of O'Neill's Irish Confederacy and a conduit to broader streams of thought. Here, more than on any other point, Friel found himself resisting O'Phelan's assessment of O'Neill's leadership. O'Phelan suggests that without O'Neill's links to Catholic countries on the continent, the old Gaelic world would have died like the Incas and left behind gifts only to the antiquary and the philologist. Friel, though, had observed in his own time and place how the amalgamation of Irish nationalism and Catholicism had deepened cultural and political divisions within Ireland. Whatever the merits of O'Neill's strategy in his time, Friel did not consider the continuing identification likely to result in a desirable future. This attitude would shape his own approach to O'Neill's biography in making history. Friel loved the great O'Neill for the way in which it brings the vanished Elizabethan world to life in all its complexity. Unfortunately, as he quickly discovered when he decided to write a play about him, O'Neill's life was dramatic in every way, except the literal one. Its events sprawled over an awkwardly long period of time, involved a huge cast of characters from multiple countries, and took place in a series of milieux unfamiliar to modern audiences. Moreover, and most important, the conflict that chiefly interested Friel was an internal one, played out within O'Neill's hybrid mind. The chieftain, in short, would make a compelling protagonist for a novel. The encyclopedic knowledge of O'Neill's life and times, which informed Friel's thinking about the play, also made it hard for him to render his subject's career intelligibly. The more he knew about O'Neill, the less he could decide what to think about him. He had far too many conflicting ideas about the man to fit coherently into a 2-hour drama. Friel's notes towards making history consist to an extraordinary degree of questions. Many recur at regular intervals during the 4 years from December 1983 through December 1987 that he spent writing the play, indicating the extent to which they remained open until a very late stage of the writing process. Apart from queries about his main character's motivations, the most important ones concern structure and style. Friel wanted to convey both O'Neill's power at its height and his abjection in defeat, and he was torn between linear and retrospective modes of storytelling. The former had the advantage of suspense and immediacy, while the latter would afford audiences the critical hindsight with which to assess O'Neill's actions. In his first set of notes, dated 7 December 1983, Friel hit upon the idea of setting Act 1 in O'Neill's pre-consale full power and Act 2 post-consale, the form the finished play eventually took. Yet he continued to revisit the structural question for nearly 3 additional years, until at least early October 1986. Repeatedly weighing the possibility of setting the play after O'Neill's defeat and presenting events from earlier in his life in flashbacks. He returned frequently to a scene suggested by Friel, in which an aged, drunken O'Neill, stranded in Rome after fleeing Ireland in 1607 with another Gaelic leader and their households, an event known in Irish nationalist mythology as the Flight of the Earls, watches helplessly as a church official sharing his living quarters, Archbishop Lombard, writes a history that turns him into a star in the face of all the facts that had reduced him to poverty, exile, and defeat. Friel could not decide, however, what the main action of his drama should be. Stylistic questions also preoccupied him, and he considered various non-naturalistic modes of presentation in an effort to make his audience think as hard about O'Neill and his relevance to modern Ireland as he himself was doing. A few months into the composition process, Friel developed an interest in O'Neill's third wife, Mabel Bagenal, who stood out from the others by virtue of her non-Gaelic lineage and upbringing. Half O'Neill's age, and the daughter of the former Queen's Marshal in Ireland, Sir Nicholas Bagenal, who for nearly 20 years had steadfastly opposed O'Neill's advancement within the English colonial system, a less likely mate for him could hardly have been imagined. Her brother, Henry, the current Queen's Marshal, vehemently opposed the match, but the couple circumvented his objections by eloping in August 1591, less than 8 months after the death of O'Neill's second wife. Friel devotes only half a dozen pages of his book to this marriage, full of incongruity and race and rank and religion, characterizing it as a rare lapse in a life marked by self-discipline and self-interest. His brief survey of the relationship relies prominently on speculation. This inexperienced English girl may finally have seemed to O'Neill's humiliated eyes nothing but a silly little weakling when he realized that his passion had betrayed his pride into a mesalliance. Nicholas Canny, an academic authority on Irish history of the period, with whom Friel corresponded as part of the research for his drama, regards the marriage differently, as a failed power play, an attempt by O'Neill to align his interests with those of the Bagenal family that backfired because Henry never accepted the union. Friel then deliberately departed from his sources in depicting O'Neill's marriage to Mabel as a genuine love match in making history. This portrayal developed gradually over a number of years, however. Adding Mabel to his contemplated cast of characters early in 1984 served less to introduce a love interest than as a way for Friel to externalize the psychic action. Including a colonist who was also on intimate terms with O'Neill allowed the playwright to convey the cultural divisions of Elizabethan Ireland and O'Neill's self-division to an audience likely ignorant of both. At times, he focused on familiar binaries in thinking about the pair, musing in late February 1984 that if the heart of the play is the Mabel-Hugh relationship, she would have to represent Protestant, Ulster, England, and New English, while he stood for Catholic, Gaelic, Ireland. At the same time, Friel saw them as individuals, subject to complementary historical imperatives. She is poised somewhere between her new colony and England, while he is poised somewhere between the dying Gaelic past and an unknowable future. Eventually, Friel hit upon the idea of including Mabel's sister Mary as a character and shifting the responsibility for representing the official colonial attitude onto her, freeing Mabel to become a more hybrid, complex character like O'Neill himself. From the time he decided to include Mabel as a primary character, Friel associated the end of O'Neill's marriage to her with the loss of a chance for a cultural synthesis in Ireland between the Gaels and the New English, similar to that which had taken place long before between Irish natives and the Old English settlers. One of the biggest tactical challenges he faced after choosing to center his O'Neill play on the chieftain's marriage to Mabel was created by the fact that she had died in 1595, when his storied career as an Irish rebel and counter-Reformation leader was effectively just beginning. It ultimately took a combination of outright distortion of the historical record and ingenious stagecraft to keep her and the modern-day resonances evoked by her at the forefront of the audience's consciousness throughout the drama. Numerous scholars have pointed out the unreliability of Friel's version of Irish history in the play with regard to dates and other details. But giving a fine-grained and accurate account of the 1590s in Ireland was not Friel's primary purpose in writing making history. Rather, he wanted to offer his audiences an alternative history that would prompt them to reconsider what they thought they knew about the legendary figures of Hugh O'Neill and his chief ally, Hugh O'Donnell. But as he put it in notes made during the writing of the play, I don't think my function is to provide a flowing and logical chronology. I think my function is satisfying if I provide a half a dozen key episodes, stepping stones, dramatic points of reference, so that, for example, when the flight of the earls is mentioned, what images does it conjure up? Defeated men scuttling away, deserting their people, betraying their trust. Friel cared what his audiences thought about the flight of the earls because their beliefs about the Gaelic Confederacy's leaders had the power to influence their attitudes and actions in the late 20th century. He wrote Making History as a disciple of Archbishop Lombard, telling an engaging story with a political moral for his own time. Read with this aim in mind, Friel's version of O'Neill's career brims with contemporary relevance, but the dramatist makes his case with the tools appropriate to his own trade. Rather than telling audiences things, he shows them. In Act 1, we see O'Neill happy, rich, and powerful, in a position of authority in both Gaelic and English systems, and engaged in a loving relationship with a Protestant woman of New English stock. In Act 2, after he has resorted to war on behalf of Ireland and Catholicism, we see him hunted, reviled by his own people, stripped of his power and wealth, and existing in a depressing, all-male void. Although we cannot know what would have happened if O'Neill had continued his established policy of strategic surrender and cooperation with the English, we can see clear parallels between the wasted, famine-ridden land O'Neill leaves behind him when he goes into exile and Northern Ireland in the late 1980s. The marriage between O'Neill and Mabel serves as the play's primary vehicle for these ideas about Ireland's best future. Although both journalistic and academic critics invariably refer to Mabel as English, a proper understanding of the play's political subtext requires the recognition that she is more accurately described as an Ulster Protestant. Establishing this identity is an important part of her conversation with her sister in Act 1, Scene 2, in which the siblings discuss in loving detail the landscape surrounding their childhood home in Newry, the only home, besides O'Neill's house, that Mabel has ever known. Friel's portrayal of her relationship with O'Neill is both a more realistic depiction of a functional marriage than one generally finds in literature, and a powerful metaphor for the sort of partnership that might be possible between nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland. From the beginning of making history, Friel takes pains to establish Mabel as a person of substance. Any initial impression that O'Neill is just another middle-aged man besotted with a woman young enough to be his daughter is dispelled by her first appearance, when she meets his openly hostile co-conspirators, Hugh O'Neill and Archbishop Peter Lombard. Despite her youth and inexperience, she displays an impressive sang-froid in this difficult situation, as Friel's stage directions emphasize. Later, alone with O'Neill, Mabel admits to having been terrified. O'Neill teasingly informs her that all the bloodthirsty rumors she has heard about O'Donnell are true, and that an archbishop is much worse than a priest, advising her to look at her hand, which he says is turning black. She reacts with an exaggerated alarm. Then, when she realizes she has been fooled, responds unexpectedly with a great whoop of laughter and punches him. By the end of the scene, O'Neill's insistence that I have married a very talented, a very spirited, a very beautiful young woman seems a plain statement of fact. Significantly, their marriage is harmonious in the musical rather than the colloquial sense. Throughout making history, Friel highlights their differences of opinion, major and minor. O'Neill and Mabel are on stage together for only about a fourth of the play, and they spend at least a quarter of that time at odds. If one looks exclusively at exchanges in which they are focused on conversation with each other, more than half their dialogue is devoted to arguing or fighting. In Act 2, although Mabel never appears in person, O'Neill describes to O'Donnell a debate he has been having with her. A discreet and dutiful wife, Friel's Mabel is nevertheless unafraid to challenge her aristocratic husband on his own ground, and he values her advice even when he doesn't take it. Their most heated dispute comes at the end of Act 1, when Mabel urges O'Neill to stop the impending Spanish invasion on the grounds that this isn't what we really want to happen. Here, as elsewhere, her primary role is to tell O'Neill, for the benefit of the audience, things he already knows. She reminds him, for instance, that you're the only Irish chieftain who understands the political method. That's why the Queen is never quite sure how to deal with you. You're the antithesis of what she expects a Gaelic chieftain to be. That's your strength. And that's why your instinct now is not to gamble everything on one big throne that is more than risky. She's right. But the implication that she knows her husband better than he knows himself annoys him. O'Neill insists that with Spain and Rome behind the Gaelic forces, the Confederacy has an excellent chance of success. But she counters with the argument that Spain and the papacy are only using Ireland's war against England to advance their own agendas and will move on as soon as they encounter difficulties. England, in contrast, will throw everything she has into this war, a war England must win because her very survival is at stake. Compared to this nation state that is united and determined and powerful and led by a very resolute woman, O'Neill's compatriots are merely an impromptu alliance of squabbling tribesmen, grabbing at religion as a coagulant, only because they have no other idea to inform them or give them cohesion. Mabel's interpretation of O'Neill's essential problem derives from Friel, who in his 1942 biography of O'Neill summed it up as disunity among the people, a unified purpose in the invader. But her critique of his solution, religion as a coagulant, is Friel's. Precisely because O'Neill suspects he's correct, however, he lashes out at Mabel after conceding most of her points, raging that for you to suggest that religion is the only coagulant that holds us together is to grossly and ignorantly overlook an age-old civilization. He escalates the argument by urging her to look at what the alternative is, the buccaneering, vulgar, material code of the new colonials. At this juncture, their political dispute turns personal with devastating results. She swings back and glares at him in hatred before announcing that she refuses any longer to live in the same house as his mistresses, whose presence she had earlier defended to her sister as part of his culture. An ultimatum O'Neill scornfully rejects. When she tells him she's pregnant, he feigns indifference, and Mabel runs from the room, her final exit in the play. O'Neill is filled with instant remorse, but O'Donnell interrupts his attempt to apologize with news that the Spanish fleet will land at Kinsale, a location identified earlier in the scene as an utterly inappropriate launching point for an attack. Thus, Friel connects O'Neill's harsh rejection of Mabel with the military campaign, doomed before it even begins. The marriage, however, proves more resilient, illustrating a crucial difference between the kind of love that leads people to get married and the kind that keeps them together through good times and bad. The first relies on the illusion that the parties have everything in common, or that the strength of their mutual attraction renders any differences unimportant. The second, more enduring, entails the recognition of each other as independent subjects, with histories, mentalities, and ends of their own, who choose to work together and compromise for the sake of the goals they share and the life they're building together. Mabel doesn't appear in Act 2 of the play, but she remains notably present in her absence. The first scene of this act begins months after the defeat of Kinsale, with O'Donnell returning from a scouting expedition to O'Neill's hiding place in the mountains. And almost as soon as he enters, he asks about Mabel. O'Neill reports that his secretary, Harry, has taken her to an ally's home to give birth, since she wasn't able to keep moving about anymore. O'Donnell, unbidden, remarks that she's been terrific, not a whimper out of her all these months, and us skulking about like tramps, and O'Neill concurs. After the two men discuss the dire strait of the country, their conversation turns to the future. O'Donnell has delegated his title to his brother and will be leaving Ireland. O'Neill has not yet decided what he'll do, but confesses that my instinct is to leave like you. O'Donnell confirms his changed opinion of O'Neill's marriage by asking, what does Mabel think? And O'Neill's reply underscores the fact that their marriage has not been salvaged at the expense of Mabel's independent thought or voice. She's urging me to hang on, pick up the pieces, start all over again. O'Donnell allows that she may be right, but his resistance grows when he hears the specifics of Mabel's advice, which involve O'Neill publicly pledging loyalty to the Queen and asking her to reinstate him to his lands with only nominal authority. When O'Donnell wonders why Elizabeth would entertain such a proposal, O'Neill explains, because she knows that the only way she can rule Ireland at this point is by using someone like me. She hates me, but she can rule through me, provided she has control over me. At least that's Mabel's argument. I think I could get enough of my people behind me, and she thinks some of the New English would back it, those that are sick of England. O'Donnell, aware that O'Neill is already writing his submission, remarks that he is indeed a tenacious bugger, adding that you and Mabel are well met. After O'Donnell and O'Neill rehearse O'Neill's submission, Harry arrives with the distressing report that Mabel died immediately after giving birth to a son who lived little more than an hour himself. He waits until the end of the scene to break this news, however. Thus, Friel keeps Mabel alive, as far as the audience is concerned, through the recounting of various political developments that vindicate her point of view on the war. Lombard has fled to Rome. Another archbishop who had encouraged the Irish rebels has gone to London to meet with the authorities there to try to prevent a backlash against the Catholics in England. And the English government wants to explore what areas of common interest might still exist between you and the crown. Most significant politically is Harry's account of a conversation with their hostess just before Mabel went into labor. When asked if her husband was considering exile, Mabel got very agitated and said, Hugh would never betray his people. At a stroke, Friel reverses the traditional nationalist valuation of the flight of the Isles. In making history, pragmatic accommodation with the colonial power of the sort that Mabel advocates represents a chance to protect Gaelic culture, while clinging to a stance of ideological purity is a form of betrayal. The history lesson had an obvious application to Ireland in the late 1980s, where present-day Republicans had a similar decision to make between political engagement with the enemy and continuing the war, even at the expense of their own people and long-term goals. Mabel's last reported words hang over the final scene of the play as a judgment upon O'Neill's decision to flee Ireland. Although Mabel's death is now many years in the past, Friel keeps her memory to the fore in ways that indicate his protagonist's feelings of guilt about failing to follow her advice to live with the consequences of his actions and make whatever concessions would be necessary to retain some authority in Ulster. The missing Mabel becomes an explicit focus of this final scene in the second half of it, as the play's closing debate between O'Neill and his biographer Lombard over what should be included in the latter's history quickly comes to center on her role in O'Neill's life. Lombard, who plans an exemplary account of Gaelic and Catholic leader, seeks to edit out the English and Protestant influences on his hero, including his English education, his pledges of loyalty to Queen Elizabeth I, and his new English wife. O'Neill, though, keeps bringing the conversation back to the question of how Mabel will be portrayed, with Lombard insisting repeatedly that she will have her place in his narrative, along with O'Neill's other three wives. Mabel, he declares, had her own value, her own importance, and at some future time and in a mode we can't imagine now, I have no doubt that story will be told fully and sympathetically. It will be a domestic story here, a love story, and a very beautiful love story it will be. Lombard's attitude is hardly surprising in a Catholic archbishop, but critics who cite these lines as a description of Friel's play itself only advertise how little they have understood it. In Ireland in the 1980s, where debates on such issues as abortion, divorce, and contraception were making it hard for both women and Protestants to identify with the Catholic inflected version of Irish nationalism represented by the Republic, making history's depiction of women's roles made a decidedly feminist statement, although this has gone largely unremarked upon by scholars. Far from serving primarily as a domestic distraction and love object, Mabel acts as her husband's trusted confidant and political advisor, and the action of the play validates her insights. It is precisely because audience members have witnessed Mabel's active engagement in his deliberations regarding the wider world that O'Neill's tacit acceptance of Lombard's limiting presentation of her part in his life strikes them as a betrayal. Critics who find making history wordy or static generally focus on this last scene of it. The effect here is deliberate, however. Audiences are made to feel on a visceral level Mabel's absence on the stage. On the symbolic level, O'Neill and the ideal of an independent and united Ireland he represents are diminished without the Ulster Protestant element represented in the play by Mabel. Lombard and O'Neill alternate lines in making history's antiphonal ending, with the former reciting the opening of the history of Hugh O'Neill he is supposedly composing, and the latter quoting from his own abject apology to Queen Elizabeth. O'Neill's speech gradually blurs into an appeal to Mabel, though, culminating in his final utterance, "Mabel, I am sorry. Please forgive me, Mabel." Against his better judgment, O'Neill has acquiesced for the second time in the play to a vision of Ireland as essentially Gaelic and Catholic that excludes her. The negative effects of his first capitulation are apparent in Act 2 of the play. Friel's original audiences were living in the bleak situation created by the second. In a program note for the field day production entitled "The Search for a Usable Past," Declan Kyberd interpreted the marriage between O'Neill and Mabel as emblematic of the impossible but desirable fusion of Gaelic and English tradition. That reading, however, is defeatist in a way that the field day enterprise was not. Friel's ambiguous conclusion invites audience members to ponder the questions raised by the debate between O'Neill and Lombard about what should be remembered and how, in the hope that they will find a way to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.